There is a sound that no training manual can prepare you for. It is not the crack of a rifle. It is not the stutter of a light machine gun. It is a sound that belongs to the end of the world. A single, continuous, shrieking roar that lasts 4 seconds and puts 200 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition into the air before a man can finish drawing a breath. Multiply that by 4. 4 barrels. 4 streams of armor-piercing incendiary tracer fire, each round burning white-hot magnesium as it crosses the darkness, converging on a single point in space where, 1 second ago, a human being was standing. Now there is nothing there. Not a body, not a wound, a vapor, a stain, a memory. This is the story of the weapon the Germans called the Fleischwurf, the meat chopper. A weapon that was never designed to kill infantry. A weapon that was built to shoot down airplanes, and was instead turned upon the men of the Waffen SS at ground level, at point-blank range, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in the winter of 1944. What happened next was not a battle. It was an industrial erasure of a massed human assault by a machine that could deliver 3,000 rounds per minute of the most destructive small arms cartridge ever fielded by an army. If you have spent years searching for a channel that refuses to sanitize the mechanical brutality of real combat, that speaks to you as a veteran, a student of war, a purist who wants the technical truth and not a Hollywood footnote, then you have found it. Subscribe now and join us. Every episode is built for the ones who already know the difference between a battle and a slaughter, and who want to understand exactly why. Now, to understand what happened on that frozen night, you first need to understand what the American infantryman was facing on the other side of those trees. By December of 1944, the Western Front had become a grinding, exhausting stalemate for the common American rifleman. The euphoria of the Normandy breakout and the race across France had evaporated. The armies had outrun their supply lines. Fuel was short. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement troops, 18 and 19-year-old boys pulled out of basic training weeks early, were being fed into depleted rifle companies holding vast stretches of the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The High Command considered the Ardennes a quiet sector, a place to rest shattered divisions and break in green ones. The forests were dense. The ridgelines were icy. The fog sat in the valleys like a wet gray blanket that swallowed sound and direction. And the men holding those lines were spread painfully thin, sometimes a single rifle squad responsible for a frontage that doctrine said required a full platoon. Their weapons were adequate, but limited. The M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle was the finest infantry rifle in the world. 8 rounds of .30-06, clip-fed, accurate to 500 yards in the hands of a trained marksman. But it was a semi-automatic. 1 trigger pull, 1 round. Against massed infantry, a single rifleman with a Garand could put out perhaps 30 aimed rounds per minute. The squad's base of fire came from the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, a magnificent but heavy weapon that fired the same .30-06 cartridge from a 20-round box magazine in either semi-automatic or fully automatic mode. Its cyclic rate was roughly 550 rounds per minute, but the practical sustained rate was far lower because of the small magazine. The squad also had access to the M1919A4, Browning's .30 caliber, belt-fed, water-cooled medium machine gun, a reliable and accurate weapon capable of sustained fire, but chambered in the same .30 caliber cartridge. It could kill a man in the open at 1,000 yards. But it could not kill a man behind a thick tree trunk. It could not reach through an earthen berm. It could not turn a stone wall into gravel. These were the limitations that the German commanders understood and intended to exploit. On the other side of that fog, under the frozen canopy of the Ardennes pines, the Waffen SS Panzergrenadier divisions were massing for what Adolf Hitler had personally ordered. A massive, desperate, last gamble offensive through the weakest point of the Allied line. The goal was to split the British and American armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was an insane gamble, and the men chosen to execute it were among the most experienced and fanatical soldiers on Earth. These were not conscripts. These were not old men and boys scraped from the bottom of the replacement barrel. The SS Panzergrenadier divisions committed to the Ardennes offensive. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, were elite formations rebuilt after the catastrophic losses of Normandy and the Eastern Front. Their infantry were hardened survivors of Kursk, of Kharkov, of the hedgerow fighting in the Bocage. They carried the MP-40 submachine gun, a simple, stamped metal, 9mm blowback weapon with a rate of fire of 500 rounds per minute and a 32-round stick magazine. It was inaccurate beyond 100 meters, but in a close-range forest assault, it was devastating. A weapon designed for exactly this kind of screaming, close-quarters, bayonet-range violence. They carried stick grenades, the Stielhandgranate Model 24, with its long wooden handle that allowed a strong man to hurl it 30 or 40 meters through the trees. They moved in dense, disciplined assault waves, not in the open, but using the trees, the ravines, the fog, closing the distance to the American positions before the defenders could bring accurate rifle fire to bear. Their tactical doctrine was simple and brutal. Overwhelm the thin American line with sheer mass, speed, and violence of action. Get inside the American perimeter before the defenders can organize a coherent base of fire. In the dark. In the fog. In the screaming chaos of a close-range forest fight where the M1 Garand's 500-yard accuracy advantage is meaningless because the enemy is 30 meters away and closing fast. They had done this on the Eastern Front against Soviet rifle divisions and won. They believed, with the absolute conviction of men who had survived 3 years of mechanized slaughter, that American infantry would break under this kind of pressure, that the green replacements would panic, that the shattered veteran divisions would simply fall apart. And in many places along the Ardennes front in those first terrible days of December 1944, they were right. But in some places, they were catastrophically, horrifically wrong. Because in some places, behind the thin line of American riflemen with their Garands and their BARs and their .30 caliber machine guns, there was something else waiting in the tree line. Something that did not care about tactical doctrine or fanatical courage or Eastern Front experience. Something that turned the mathematics of infantry combat inside out and made human wave assaults not merely futile, but suicidal. To understand that something, you need to understand a single bullet. Not the .30 caliber round of the Garand and the BAR. Something else entirely. Something that belongs to a different category of violence. The .50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge, designated the 12.7 by 99mm NATO, or 50 BMG, is not a rifle round that was scaled up. It is an anti-material cartridge. It was designed by John Moses Browning in 1918, the last year of the First World War, specifically to destroy aircraft, lightly armored vehicles, and fortified positions at extreme range. The standard M2 ball round consists of a 709-grain full metal jacket bullet, that is 46 grams of copper-jacketed lead and steel, propelled by a massive charge of smokeless powder to a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,910 feet per second. To put that in perspective, the .30-06 round fired by the M1 Garand weighs approximately 150 grains. The .50 caliber round weighs nearly 5 times as much and carries roughly 15,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The .30-06 delivers approximately 2,700. The .50 caliber has roughly 6 times the kinetic energy at the muzzle. But raw energy is only part of the story. The critical factor is what that energy does when it encounters a target. A .30 caliber bullet, the round fired by the Garand, the BAR, the M1919, will kill a man cleanly. It will punch through flesh, shatter bone, and exit the other side. It is a lethal projectile by any definition. But it has limitations. A .30 caliber round striking a mature pine tree, a tree with a trunk 12 or 15 inches in diameter, will penetrate several inches into the wood and stop. The tree becomes a viable piece of cover. A man hiding behind that tree is protected. A .30 caliber round striking a brick wall will chip the surface, perhaps penetrate one layer of brick, and stop. A .30 caliber round striking a sandbag emplacement will bury itself in the sand and go nowhere. The German infantryman in the Ardennes understood this. He had 3 years of experience with .30 caliber equivalent weapons on the Eastern Front. He knew instinctively what cover worked against rifle caliber fire. He knew that trees, stone walls, frozen earth berms, even the thick wooden walls of a Belgian farmhouse would stop or deflect a standard infantry round. The .50 caliber round does not obey these rules. A .50 caliber M2 armor-piercing round, the AP variant, contains a hardened tungsten carbide or hardened steel penetrator core inside the copper jacket. At 300 meters, this round will penetrate nearly an inch of rolled, homogeneous steel armor. It will go through the engine block of a truck and come out the other side. At the same range, it will punch completely through a mature pine tree, entering one side of the trunk, traveling through 12 or 15 inches of solid wood, and exiting the other side with enough residual energy to kill a man standing behind it. A brick wall, 2 layers of standard masonry brick, will not stop it. A sandbag emplacement, unless it is several bags deep, will not stop it. The cover that infantry has relied upon since the invention of the rifle is rendered irrelevant. And then there is the incendiary tracer variant, the M20 armor-piercing incendiary, or API. This round contains a small charge of incendiary compound, typically a barium nitrate and magnesium mixture, in the nose of the bullet ahead of the armor-piercing core, with a tracer compound, strontium peroxide, in the base. When this round strikes a target, the incendiary nose ignites on impact, burning at several thousand degrees. The tracer element in the base burns during flight, making the round's trajectory visible as a bright, reddish-white streak across the darkness. The effect of this round on a human body is not merely lethal, it is catastrophically destructive. The kinetic energy alone, over 10,000 foot-pounds at 300 meters, is sufficient to sever a human limb. The bullet does not create a neat entry wound. At close range, it removes entire sections of the human body. A direct hit to the torso does not leave a wound channel. It creates a cavitation event that is fundamentally incompatible with any recognizable human anatomy. The incendiary compound ignites flesh, clothing, and equipment on impact. The tracer compound continues to burn inside the wound. This is the projectile that John Moses Browning designed, and in 1944, in a frozen forest in Belgium, 4 of the weapons that fired this projectile were mounted together on a single turret, pointed at the ground, and aimed at men. The weapon system was called the M16 Multiple Gun Motor Carriage. Its heart was the Maxson M45 Quadmount, a powered turret designed and manufactured by the W.L. Maxson Corporation of New York. The concept was born out of desperation in the early years of the war. The Luftwaffe's low-level strafing and dive-bombing attacks on Allied ground forces demanded a weapon that could put a massive volume of fire into the air, quickly, with enough range and hitting power to destroy a fast-moving aircraft before it completed its attack run. The answer was to take 4 of Browning's M2 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 450 to 575 rounds per minute in its standard configuration, and mount them in a single, electrically powered, traversing and elevating turret. The engineering was elegant in its brutality. The 4 M2 barrels were arranged in a 2/2 configuration, 2 upper guns and 2 lower guns, with their muzzles converging at a preset range. The turret sat on a pedestal mount on the rear bed of an M3 halftrack, a 10-ton armored personnel carrier with a front-mounted White 160AX 6-cylinder inline gasoline engine producing 128 horsepower, driving the front wheels and rear tracks through a 4-speed manual transmission. The half-track's armor was thin, 6 to 13 millimeters of face-hardened steel plate. Enough to stop small arms fire and shell fragments, but nothing heavier. It was not a tank. It was a truck with tracks and a thin armored skin. But what it carried on its back was something no tank could match for sheer anti-personnel destruction. The Maxson turret was powered by a small, dedicated electrical system. A Briggs & Stratton single-cylinder gasoline generator, mounted on the floor of the half-track's fighting compartment, provided the electrical current to drive the turret's traverse and elevation motors. The gunner sat in a saddle seat behind the 4 guns, gripping 2 spade handle controls. His feet rested on 2 pedals, the firing pedals. The turret could traverse 360 degrees and elevate from -10 degrees, that is, 10 degrees below the horizontal, to positive 90 degrees, straight up. The traverse rate was approximately 60 degrees per second. The elevation rate was similar. This meant the gunner could swing the 4 barrels from one side of the horizon to the other in roughly 3 seconds. The total weight of the loaded Maxson mount was approximately 2,200 pounds. Ammunition was fed from 4 ammunition cans, 1 per gun, mounted on the sides of the turret frame. These were not standard belt cans. They were the distinctive 200-round tombstone ammunition chests, tall, flat, rectangular steel boxes, roughly shaped like an upright tombstone, each containing a 200-round disintegrating metallic link belt of 50 caliber ammunition. With 1 can per gun, the total ready ammunition on the turret was 800 rounds. Total ammunition carried on the half-track, including reserves stored in the hull, was typically in the range of 4,000 to 5,000 rounds. The combined cyclic rate of fire of the 4 M2 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously was approximately 2,000 to 2,300 rounds per minute at the standard M2 cyclic rate. Some sources cite rates as high as 3,000 rounds per minute when the guns were tuned to their maximum rate. At the lower figure, 2,000 rounds per minute, that is 33 rounds per second. At the higher figure, it is 50 rounds per second. 50 individual 46-gram armor-piercing incendiary tracer projectiles per second, each one traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, each one capable of severing a human limb, penetrating a tree trunk, or punching through an inch of steel plate. The weapon was designed to kill airplanes, but by the winter of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a broken force over the Western Front. Allied air superiority was so complete that the M16 crews spent most of their time waiting for enemy aircraft that never appeared. And so, out of the brutal pragmatism that defines American combat improvisation, the commanders began using the M16 for something it was never designed to do. They pointed it at the ground. The tactical logic was undeniable. Here was a weapon system that could deliver a volume of fire that no infantry formation on Earth could withstand. Not from a fixed position, but from a mobile, armored platform that could be driven directly to the point of a breakthrough and brought into action in seconds. The thin armor of the half-track was vulnerable to anti-tank weapons, but against infantry armed with rifles, submachine guns, and grenades, it was effectively impervious. And the 450 caliber guns, depressed to 0 elevation or below, turned every piece of cover the enemy infantry relied upon into a death trap. This is what was waiting for the SS Panzergrenadiers in the frozen darkness of the Ardennes. The assault came in the pre-dawn blackness. The fog was dense. The temperature was well below freezing. The snow crunched underfoot, and every sound carried through the still, frozen air with a clarity that made stealth impossible and amplified terror. The SS infantry moved forward in their practiced assault formation, dense waves of men spaced at intervals, MP40s at the hip, stick grenades in hand, voices low, officers whispering commands. They had done this 100 times on the Eastern Front. They knew the rhythm. Close the distance, get inside the enemy's perimeter, use speed, mass, and aggression to overwhelm the defenders before they can organize. The first contact was as they expected. M1 Garand fire, sharp, individual cracks in the darkness. Tracers from 30 caliber machine guns stitching through the trees, bark flying, snow kicking up. The Americans were firing, but the volume was thin, manageable. The SS soldiers pressed forward, using the trees as cover, leapfrogging forward in short rushes, the MP40s chattering in short bursts, the stick grenades arcing through the air and detonating with sharp, flat cracks that sent shrapnel hissing through the undergrowth. The American line was bending. The riflemen were being pushed back. The gap was opening. And then the M16s came forward. The half-tracks ground through the frozen mud and snow with their tracks clawing for traction, the exhaust from the white engines leaving white plumes in the frozen air. They pulled into position behind the faltering infantry line. 2, perhaps 3 half-tracks spaced at intervals. The Maxson turrets swung toward the advancing Germans. The gunners, cold, terrified, adrenaline flooding their bloodstreams, depressed the 4 barrels until they were level with the ground. The electric motors whined as the turrets traversed, the barrels tracking across the dark tree line where the shapes of the advancing SS infantry were visible as flickering shadows in the muzzle flashes of their own weapons. The gunners depressed the foot pedals. What happened next lasted perhaps 8 to 10 seconds. In those 8 to 10 seconds, the world changed for every German soldier within 400 meters of those guns. 4 solid streams of armor-piercing incendiary tracer fire, each stream a continuous, shrieking river of reddish-white light, erupted from the Maxson turrets. The sound was not gunfire. It was a single, continuous, tearing roar, a sound like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped apart by a machine, that was physically painful at close range. The air pressure wave from the muzzle blast could be felt in the chest cavity. The ground shook. The tracers were visible, 4 converging streams of burning magnesium, each round a bright point of light, moving so fast that they blurred into solid red lines in the darkness. They reached across the open ground and into the tree line with the speed of light itself, or so it seemed to the men on both sides. The first round struck the leading SS infantrymen at a range of perhaps 150 to 200 meters. At that range, the 50 caliber API rounds were still traveling at well over 2,500 feet per second. They carried over 11,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy each. The effect was not something the human mind is capable of fully processing. Men did not fall. Men did not drop. Men came apart. The round struck with such force that human bodies were separated into constituent pieces. A torso here, a limb there, a helmet spinning through the air with nothing beneath it. The incendiary compound ignited on impact, brief, searing flashes of white light in the darkness, each one marking the point where a 50 caliber round had intersected a human body. The tracer compound continued to burn inside what remained, but the killing was not limited to direct hits. This was the true horror of the meat chopper. The rounds that missed a human target, and most of them did, because even at 2,000 rounds per minute, the probability of a direct hit on a single, moving, man-sized target in a dark forest is low. Those rounds hit the trees, and the trees were not cover. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds punched through pine trunks like an ice pick through cardboard. Trees that the SS soldiers were using as cover, trees that would have stopped 30 caliber rounds all day long, simply exploded. The rounds went through the first tree, through the man behind the tree, and into the next tree. Wood splinters the size of bayonets were blasted outward in every direction. The air filled with a horizontal blizzard of wooden shrapnel, high-velocity splinters that acted as secondary projectiles, tearing into flesh and eyes and throats. Within seconds, the carefully maintained tree line that the German soldiers were advancing through began to physically disintegrate. Trunks were cut through at waist height. Trees toppled. The structural integrity of the forest itself was being destroyed by the sheer volume of high-velocity steel passing through it. The German advance did not stop. It ceased to exist. The men at the front of the assault waves were killed so quickly and so completely that the men behind them, the second and third waves, did not initially understand what had happened. They kept advancing into the kill zone, and they were killed the same way. The four streams of tracer fire swept back and forth across the tree line, the gunners traversing slowly, methodically, the electric motors humming, the barrels smoking, the spent brass cascading from the breaches in a continuous golden waterfall that piled up around the gunners' feet. The surviving SS soldiers, the men at the rear of the formation, the ones who were far enough back that the tracers had not yet reached them, flattened themselves into the snow and tried to crawl behind trees, behind frozen earth mounds, behind anything solid. And then they discovered the second terrible truth about the .50 caliber round. The trees they were hiding behind were not protection. The rounds came through the trees. The frozen earth berms they pressed their bodies against, the rounds came through those too. There was no cover. There was no concealment that mattered. The weapon was firing through the forest itself, through wood, through dirt, through everything the infantry soldier's instinct told him to hide behind. The psychological effect was absolute. These were SS Panzergrenadiers, men who had charged Soviet machine gun nests on the Eastern Front, men who had fought through the bocage hedgerows in Normandy, men whose entire identity was built on the absolute refusal to retreat. And they broke. They turned and ran. They crawled backward through the snow, leaving their weapons, leaving their wounded, leaving their dead, who were, in many cases, no longer recognizable as dead, because what the .50 caliber rounds had left behind was not something that could be identified as a human casualty in any traditional sense. The American gunners fired until the 200-round tombstone cans ran dry. The barrels glowed cherry red in the darkness, literally incandescent with heat, the heat shimmer rising from the barrel groups like a mirage in a desert. The gun crews, the loaders, the assistant gunners, pulled on thick asbestos-lined gloves and lifted the scorching barrels from the breeches, replacing them with fresh, cold, spare barrels from the rack on the side of the half-track. The spent tombstone cans were thrown over the side, and fresh ones were locked into place. The loaders' hands shook, not from the cold, not from fear, but from the vibration. The entire half-track had been vibrating like a tuning fork while the four guns fired, the suspension rocking on its springs, the hull ringing with the concussion. And then, silence. The guns stopped. The roar, that world-ending, tearing, shrieking roar, ceased. And what replaced it was a silence so total and so sudden that it felt like a physical pressure on the eardrums. The gunners' ears were ringing, a high, keening whine that would last for hours and, for some of them, for the rest of their lives. The fog was thicker now, thickened by the smoke of burning wood, by the cordite fumes from thousands of expended rounds, by the faintly sweet, sickening chemical smell of the tracer and incendiary compounds. The air tasted of copper and carbon. The snow in front of the M16 positions was no longer white. It was gray and black, covered in a fine layer of wood dust and brass shavings, churned into a slurry of frozen mud by the violence of the concussion waves. In the tree line ahead, nothing moved. The dawn came slowly, a pale, gray, reluctant light that seeped through the fog and gradually revealed the extent of what the meat chopper had done. The tree line was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. For a width of perhaps 200 meters, the width of the gunner's traverse, the trees had been reduced to splintered stumps. The taller pines had been cut in half, their upper sections laying in the snow, still connected to the stumps by ragged strips of bark and heartwood. The forest floor was carpeted inches deep in wood chips, white, raw, fresh-cut wood exposed and steaming faintly in the cold air. Among the wood chips were the remains of the SS assault force. The American infantry who moved forward to clear the position after dawn would later describe what they saw in terms that the official after-action reports would sanitize into clinical language. Enemy casualties were severe. But the men themselves used different words. They spoke of finding pieces. They spoke of finding equipment, an MP40 here, a leather belt there, a boot with something still inside it, scattered across the killing ground as if a giant hand had swept through the forest and erased everything in its path. They spoke of the difficulty of counting casualties because the concept of an individual casualty no longer applied. The official estimates varied wildly. Dozens, scores, perhaps over 100 in a single engagement. But the numbers were almost meaningless because the bodies could not be individually distinguished. The Germans had their own word for the M16. They called it the Fleischwolf, the meat grinder, or, more colloquially, the meat chopper. The name spread through the German ranks with the speed of battlefield rumor, carried by the traumatized survivors of those first engagements. It became a word that triggered immediate, visceral fear. Not the professional, calculated caution that a veteran feels when he hears an enemy tank, but a primal, animal terror. The SS veterans, men who genuinely did not fear death in the conventional sense, feared the meat chopper. Because the meat chopper did not merely kill, it unmade. It erased. It reduced the human body and the human being's last psychological refuge, the concept of meaningful cover, to nothing. This was the brutal adaptation of industrial warfare at its most naked. A machine built to shoot down airplanes, a weapon of anti-aircraft defense, repurposed by desperate, pragmatic men into the most terrifying anti-personnel weapon system of the Second World War. It was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It was 4 heavy machine guns bolted to a turret, powered by a lawnmower engine mounted on the back of a truck, and fired by a single man pressing pedals with his feet. And it could erase a battalion-strength infantry assault in under a minute. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage served in every theater of the war. It fought in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, in Belgium, in Germany. It was used against aircraft when aircraft appeared. It was used against ground targets when they did not. Its crews became some of the most feared and most requested assets on the battlefield. Infantry commanders begging for M16 support the way a drowning man begs for a rope. After the war, the Quadmount concept lived on, the basic design evolving into later systems, the principle unchanged. Mass a volume of heavy caliber fire so overwhelming that no human formation can survive it. There is a lesson in the meat chopper that extends beyond the specifics of 1944. It is a lesson about what happens when industrial ingenuity is married to desperation. When engineers build a machine for one purpose, and soldiers, under the pressure of imminent death, discover that it serves another purpose with a lethality that no one anticipated. The SS Panzergrenadiers who charged through those frozen trees were among the best trained, most experienced, most fanatically motivated infantry soldiers in the history of warfare. They had conquered Europe. They had held the Eastern Front against impossible odds. They believed, with justification, that their aggression, their discipline, and their willingness to die made them unstoppable. They were wrong. Because in the end, courage cannot outrun 3,000 rounds per minute. Discipline cannot hide behind a tree that a 50 caliber round passes through like light through glass. And fanaticism, no matter how absolute, cannot reassemble what the meat chopper has torn apart. If this is the kind of history you came here for, the unvarnished, technically precise, deeply human truth about what weapons do and what war costs, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe. Stay with us. Because this channel exists for one reason: to honor the tactical reality of combat by telling it exactly as it happened, with no apology and no sanitization. Every round, every mechanism, every consequence. This is where tactical history lives. The snow fell again that night in the Ardennes. It covered the wood chips. It covered the brass. It covered what was left of the men who had charged into the teeth of the meat chopper, believing that courage alone could carry the day. By morning, the forest was white again, silent, pristine, and utterly indifferent to the violence that had occurred beneath its canopy. The war moved on. The guns were reloaded. The barrels were replaced. And somewhere in the darkness of the next tree line, the electric motor of a Maxson turret hummed quietly, waiting.